Hello, my name is Matthew, and this is Empire of the Sun YouTube channel. It is a religious history YouTube channel focusing on English religious history from about 1780 up to the early 2000s. And in it, I want to make the case that all history is religious history. And that means in order to understand English history and English society, the better grasp we have of its religious roots, the more we will understand and the more we can grasp what it is people thought they were doing throughout their lives. So in order to introduce it to you, I thought what I'd do is I take you to the town that's just 3 miles south of where I live called Bridgnorth. And this town is just an ordinary market town in the south of Shropshire. I want to walk you round St Leonard's Close, but in order to get there first, you will see this is Church Street, and there's a gap there. These are almshouses on the left, and there's a gap on the left where the World War II bombing happened, destroyed a house. They had to bash a bit more down, and they made it into a memorial garden. As you walk up Church Street, you can see that it opens out into this beautiful church, which was renovated by the Victorians, by a particular reverend called the Reverend George Bellett, who was there, minister there for 35 years. But this close in general, I'm just going to pause the video there a second. This St Leonard's Close that we're about to come into has such a weird variety of English religious history. It makes it utterly fascinating to me. In the 17th century, in 1640 to 1641, Richard Baxter lived there. He was the assistant minister for this church for a period of about 2 years. He lived in a house which is just on the left, which we'll see in a minute. In 1835, a minister, a priest called the Reverend George Bellett, turned up to find a dilapidated church, and a church ripped apart by its theological divisions. And then in the 1980s, the late 1980s, in the far left-hand corner of St Leonard's Close, a recording studio called White Rabbit Studios was set up, and there lots of Christian or white metal bands, particularly thrash metal, was recorded in there. So what a wonderful place, a sort of strange religious history there, covering from 1640 up to the 1980s. So as we turn to come into St Leonard's Close, you can see there's one of the buildings that's the grammar school. We haven't even got time to touch on that, but this black and white cottage here with the roses outside is Baxter's cottage. He was a Puritan born in which is now Telford, a part of Telford and Wrekin. As I said, he was the assistant minister. He left in 1641, heavily influenced by nonconformity, wrote over 200 books, incredibly famous. The Saints' Everlasting Rest and The Reformed Pastor being two of his most famous books. Baxter did not like Bridgnorth people. He said they were stubborn, stiff-necked, irreligious. He bemoaned the lack of success in his ministry here, and soon he left and became extremely famous in Kidderminster, which is just 15 miles south. And as we come round to the left-hand side of St Leonard's Close, we're coming near to where in the 1980s this Christian heavy metal was recorded in a basement of a house called the Mundens, which has now changed its name. There were bands like Seventh Angel from the West Midlands and Detritus from Bristol and Stairway, all recorded in this close in the 1980s. Now, heavy metal itself was kind of invented. If you read academic papers on it, they tend to argue that it's invented in the West Midlands by bands like Black Sabbath, by Judas Priest, and then half of Led Zeppelin are from the West Midlands, and the others are from, two of them are from London. Now, sociologists tend to argue that heavy metal itself requires a Judeo-Christian worldview to understand it and for it to all make sense, because even though a large amount of it was a rejection of the Christian worldview, there it is, there's the house which was the Mundens there, and that is St Leonard's sort of admin center it used to be, and then the back of the beautiful church, beautifully restored by George Bellett. But a Judeo-Christian worldview is important, say sociologists, in understanding heavy metal, which may explain why it collapsed in the mid-90s when the rise of grunge. Now, Christian heavy metal was very different to contemporary Christian music. So the more poppy side, let's just pause this video one more time. The more poppy side of Christian music was generally for reaching out to people who were already Christians. So a lot of music would go into churches where the concerts would be done, and you as a member of the church or a Christian would attend the concert, and you may take the evangelistic element was really that you would take a friend there with you, and they would hear, oh, like, well, that's nice Christian music. Maybe they like Jesus. I like that music. Maybe I should like Jesus too. However, heavy metal, which was obviously very controversial, was very different. They played mainly secular venues, and the whole atmosphere, the whole sort of ethos changed into become evangelistic. So their music had, as would be useful for the 1980s, that they would have motifs of apocalyptic nature and spiritual warfare. So the apocalyptic nature of Revelation, the book of Revelation and Daniel. Seventh Angel recorded a demo in the studio behind one, and then they did several albums, and Detritus from Bristol recorded their album Perpetual Defiance, which uses a lot of motifs on spiritual warfare, particularly from Ephesians 6. If you look over on that, that is Lowtown. Bridgnorth is built on some kind of rock, which is like a cliff. And actually, Baxter says that the people of Bridgnorth are as hard as the rock that the town is built on, and it seems like he couldn't really wait to get away from it. There on the left is another beautiful building in the close, which is the original grammar school, and then behind that is the town hall. There's the church tower. So we've done Christian heavy metal. Let's now think about the church itself. The Reverend George Bellett, who seems to be like a high church Oxford movement guy, priest, turns up in 1835, and he stays until 1870, and he arrives still damaged from the English civil wars that they haven't sorted out nearly 200 years later. But he identifies that as a big problem, and by the time he leaves years later, he decides, by the time he leaves years later, he's actually rebuilt a huge part of the church. That building there, the white building, is actually an old hospital and alms houses. But the bigger problem that George Bellett found was that the church was spiritually divided. And there were those who were following the teachings of Edward Irving, called Irvingites, or the Catholic Apostolic Church as it became. And they're what we could call, I suppose, sort of proto-charismatics. If you've heard of the charismatic church, there's the hospital again. If you've heard of the charismatic church, then these are like the originators of it. And they were what's called restorationist, which was quite sort of trendy around the time of the French Revolution and for the next 50 years. And they believed that somehow that God had restored apostles and God had restored prophets to the church, and that they emphasized prophecy and the imminent return of Jesus Christ. And that sort of, in some respects, is sort of a hangover from the French Revolution. And we find that, as we look down Church Street again, we find that the millenarian, as it's called, cults and movements and sects that arrive, things like the Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, Joanna Southcott, they're all influenced by this sort of, they're all restorationist, and they're influenced by the difference in that God had taken something away, things had become corrupted, and now it was back. But George Bellett, the Reverend George Bellett, when he arrives in the church, finds that people are following this Edward Irving, this Scottish minister, and he says, the first thing I need to sort out is the religious division, the religious divide within the church. Now, it seems to me Reverend George Bellett, who's written a biography, he was like a high churchman. He was fairly influenced by the Oxford movement, wrote his memoir, stayed for 35 years. But the first thing he dealt with, he spent a few years dealing with the spiritual division before he embarked on a huge building project to sort out the whole of the church. Now, much has been written. You can buy like an in-depth guide to St. Leonard's if you go into that church, and that you will find all about the building. My interest really, and Empire of the Sun's interest really, the YouTube channel here is less about the building and more about what did George Bellett think was important? What did he think he was doing? So his memoir was published soon after his death and finished by his children, and I intend on republishing that. It's something I've done before. I published a couple of ritualist historical books, and I intend on republishing. So as part of this work here, this study of history, I will make available for people to purchase books and on religious arguments. The first one I'm going to do is actually based in South Somerset, where I used to live. But that is an argument between a Calvinist and a follower of Joanna Southcott. I'm really fascinated by religious controversy and religious dialogue. So what I want you to know really is what to expect. But before that, I'd just like to point out in that close that we just walked around, there were 2 grammar school buildings which have a religious element. There's the St. Leonard's Administrative Centre, there's the hospital, the rectory, the almshouses, the town council, all have important religious elements within them. And so often I think, as I've studied history and as I've looked through history, I found that less and less about the religious nature and religious roots of these things are being taught. So that's what I want to encourage people to think about and kind of bring back. So here's what to expect very briefly is English religious history from about 1780 to about the year 2000. And I want to really focus on what people thought they were doing. So we'll use their own writings. So we'll use what Bellett thought he was doing and his explanations. And I want to argue that English history cannot be understood without its religious context. And to begin with, the first few topics that we'll probably touch on will be millenarianism, ritualism, evangelicalism, Mormonism, that white Christian heavy metal and thrash metal. And we'll look at all of those things and see how they fit into what the church has become and how things have progressed since. You will get videos on YouTube. There will be a Substack, which there will be hopefully a link below, and I will be publishing books and sort of longer documentary type, but very homemade by me, videos and for YouTube. You can contact me. Again, I'll put that below. Yeah, and hopefully you'll like some of it, and you'll join me in this exploration of English religious history.